On today's episode, we learn how there's no difference between token characters and well-written ones. We find the education system is performing admirably. See a take on how you can't be upset about one loan forgiveness program because another one exists. Find Pfizer appealing to the court of popular opinion. Learn why the Supreme Court isn't legitimate, but only when they enact bad decisions. And lastly, we hear Ben Shapiro's take on the lessons learned from 9/11. This is Cringe Posts. Hello, friends. Welcome to this episode of the Cringe Posts podcast. This is the show where we gather the cringiest political and cultural takes that we find in our media feeds, and we talk about them. We take them apart. We challenge the underlying assumptions that are being made, and we, of course, make fun of them because we like to laugh. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host, Britt. And as a reminder, we would love it if you would comment and share, subscribe, leave us a review. All that good stuff helps us in the algorithm. And if you're listening to this on an audio platform, but you want to see the cringes, either now or at a later time, you can go to cringeposts.com and look at our visual guide there, where we put all of the posts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, well, they're already on the video. Before we make fun of other people's cringes, we always like to start by criticizing our own bad posts or memories. And so we're coming to a time where we're running out of posts because we've done this for nearly 100 episodes. And so there might be a transition in the near future, but for now we are finding the last remnants of cringe that we can find that we haven't buried in the depths of deletion of the internet, tried to, get it away from the world. And so today we've got a story that Britt remembers back from 2010 or so, when he was texting a friend from camp, if I recall.
Yes. Yeah. So the quote I've got up on the screen, it reads, "If we don't fight them over there, we will fight them over here." And then I titled Brit via text message 2010-ish. So back in 2010, I had been at this church camp thing, and I met a friend over there, and her and I were texting after, and we fancied ourselves deep conversationalists. So we were talking about all the different wars and things going on, and she's like, "I just really don't like what we're doing over there," and I was like, "No, it's necessary. I think it's a just war. And if we don't fight them over there, we'll fight them over here." And I said that simply because I'd heard some pundit say it at some point. I didn't really actually think about whether that's true or not, because it's not true. It turns out that when you blow up people over there, eventually they do come over here to take revenge. That's usually what happens. But yeah, I think, I think a lot of my worst takes that have existed forever, whether in text message or online, have been pretty pro-war stuff, which I'm pretty ashamed of in a lot of ways, because even a child knows, right, that you shouldn't hurt other people, or you should at least hurt other people only with a lot of thought, consideration about self-defense and things like that. So there's kind of a running theme there, and I very much, I was very pro, we need to be over there, and it's good. I remember watching Saddam Hussein's statue get toppled over, and I thought, wow, we're good. They're going to have democracy in Iraq. We're going to overturn thousands of years of precedent, and of culture in a year and a half. I was just very foolish and silly.
It's frustrating because the way that media and conversations surrounding politics portray it lends itself to taking those catchphrases and those slogans that if we don't fight them over there, we'll fight them over here. And you don't have to think, you don't have to do any actual thinking about the situation or the context. You can just shortcut because you're like, oh, someone smart said this, and I can repeat it.
And it sounds snappy. It's
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, my brother will laugh because we had a friend, and this was probably 2003 or 2004. But I was pretty young. I was like 8 or 9 or something around that time. And, I remember we had a friend whose parents were very liberal, and they didn't like George W. Bush, and my parents were conservative, and they did like George W. Bush. So naturally the kids, we liked George W. Bush, and their son did not. Yeah. And I remember we were talking about things, and at one point, for some reason, my brother and I remember this very distinctly, and it's just a stupid thing, but he said, "Bush wants war." And what's so funny about it is it's he doesn't know any more than, anyone does if Bush won war. Now as it comes around, I tend to think Bush maybe didn't, but Dick Cheney did. But it's like he tended to be more on the truth, but he didn't have any reason to say that. He was just a phrase he heard some adult say. And similarly, we didn't have any insight into George W. Bush or the motivations of any invasions, but we were of course defending him. So it's just funny because the way that the way that our culture treats politics, it's like you can have anyone discussing it with any legitimacy, let alone whether they've thought through the ideas, whether they can make the full picture argument to you, or even just like the comparison of basic history. Like you said, like you're going to overturn 1,000 years of precedent in one fell swoop, give them democracy. It's like any student of history knows that that's not how kingdoms, empires, lands work.
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that, like about echoing your parents' sentiments, because very much the same way my parents voted for W, and I asked, I was like, I remember election night in 2000, and I remember being like, well, why do I want George W. Bush versus Al Gore? And they're like, well, the Republican Party believes in lower taxes and smaller government, and we believe that things get better with that, and so that's why we vote for them. I was like, okay, that makes sense. Like we want everything to be smaller, but it's like, even my parents, at the time, it's like, okay. And then you elected a president that probably had the biggest at that time expansion of government power with the Patriot Act and other things that had ever happened ever. And then every president after him has expanded even more so. So it's just funny how like we all buy it hook, line, and sinker because it's like, well, that's what they say they are, so that must be what they are. And
yeah. Well, I mean, with of course George W. I mean, again, he was actually kind of similar to Obama in that he campaigned.
He did
pretty well, but by the time 2004 rolls around, anyone should have known better. But I remember the big thing why we didn't want John Kerry was because he was a flip flopper. Like what? Like okay, every politician is what? Like why is that this irredeemable arc? Well, no, you can't vote for him. He's a flip flopper.
I also liked during maybe we're getting too far in the weeds on this, but in 2004, like the effort to paint John Kerry, rightfully so, as like an elitist, and W. Bush is like some like down to earth. Like I remember someone showing me this like email chain, like it was like a meme, but of the 2004s. It's like, oh, you could have this president and it's George W. Bush shucking corn, or you could have John Kerry with the surfboard. And it's like, these guys are both two sides of the same elitist coin, like built from super rich families or married into rich families in Kerry's case, and super elitist and think that they're better than you. Like they're not, just because one is in a cornfield does not mean that he's any different than the guy with the surfboard.
The Michael Malice quote comes to mind that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton have more in common with each other than Hillary Clinton does with her average voter.
Yes, yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and it's perfect. But anyway, yes, enough reminiscing on the past there. Fortunately, Britt does not text me things like that now, so we're good. No. So we're going to start off with another cultural take that I found, and this is a little similar to the things last week, but it's got a different bend to it, and I wanted to address it because it's just another case of people getting the absolute wrong, just I don't know, red herring type arguments or straw mans. So this tweet reads, if a show was released today where a disabled girl dominated 90% of the fights she was in, was never a love interest to anyone, and actually taught the male protagonist 25% of his combat skill set, they'd call it woke propaganda. Anyway, her name is Toph, and then shows the character Toph from Avatar: The Last Airbender. And what I find so appalling about this take is the reductionist level of thinking you get when you fall into intersectionalism. When you start thinking the only things that matter are you disabled? Are you a person of color? Are you a female? When you think in those boxes, you reduce everyone's thinking to those. And it's like, no. So Avatar was on when I was growing up, but we didn't have that channel growing up, so I didn't watch it live. I only watched it like 2 years ago. I watched it through, and it's a kids show, so obviously there's kids humor and kids stuff. But I kept watching and I enjoyed it because it's a well-written series. And the fundamental key thing here is Toph is a character with character development. She has weaknesses. The main character has weaknesses, and they grow, and it's realistic. And like you're not it's not a poorly written character. It's not someone who feels tokenized. The fact that she's blind isn't a like, oh, they're making a token disabled character. It was part of her character. It's part of who she was. It was part of her struggle. And the crazy thing is, it didn't try to say she's not, it's not a disadvantage. They tried to say you can be strong in spite of that. And I think that so much of the bad writing from these people who think in intersectional terms, in particular with disabilities, is they try to say, look, this person's disabled and it doesn't affect them in any way, shape, or form, other than giving them a victim card to use when they want to use it. But in any other, there's no other disadvantage. Whereas in the show, multiple times, because she's blind, she's able to overcome it in so many ways, but there are specific things that she suffers from because she's blind. And it affects her character. She doesn't just gloss over it, and she's well written. So I watched this in 2020 when wokeism was alive and well. And no, I didn't think it was a woke propaganda thing, because it wasn't, because she was well written.
Yeah, it makes her human. I know she's like human in the series and all that, but like if she's an earthbender, but like her blindness is like, I guess, an equivalent thing. Like, this is where I would become annoyed. Let's say that Toph is not blind, and she never really trains or practices or does anything, and she's really, really good at earthbending. Just the first time she tries it, the first time she meets Aang, she's really good at it. And Aang is not a kid. He's been doing this for 30 years and he's a master at it. She's amazing at it. Great. Teaches him everything and says, you've got it all wrong, and leaves, and she's still the hero. And anyway, her name would be Rey, from The Last Jedi. That would be what it is. That's literally what it is, because it's like Rey has that's the type of woke character that we don't like. Not just because you're trying to hoist, someone's ideology upon us by using a character as a vehicle for it, but it's also just a poorly written character. It's like there's nothing to relate to. There's no struggle to overcome. There's no hero's journey within that. Like, Toph is amazing because her blindness is actually a detriment to her being able to succeed, and she has to work really hard. And and what's cool about her is like her earthbending power. Like, she figures out how to use that to compensate, for her blindness and all these different things. Like, she can feel things through the ground and all that. But it's also like, if there's no earth or anything for her to touch, to go around with that, then she's kind of toast, And so that makes it really interesting. It makes you, there's actual growth for the character. She's able to become, a better person over time. Whereas if you just start out like, oh, I'm amazing, all powerful, and oh yeah, the wisdom of a 30-year-old, Jedi master doesn't apply to me, and he got it all wrong. It's like, well, what am I watching you for? Like, there's nothing for me to grab onto. There's no struggle. It's just like you went into the video game and entered a cheat code. Like, if you go into like one of the things, like there's this game called Ark I used to play a little bit of, and it was just so darn fun, man. I love playing it. And one time I was up to like 4 a.m. playing it, and I was like, I got to be done playing this. And so I know for me how I can make myself lose interest in a video game is I'll just put on cheats and just get everything that I need in the game. So like I get in the Iron Man suit in the game. I'm like, I'm bored of this now, and that's what these stories are. It's like you give these characters cheat codes, and there's just nothing free. It's like, well, I see where they end up, and they didn't do it. The journey is worth more than the actual destination. And that's what this woke culture and propaganda gets wrong. It's like, it's not about, it's not about you being, all powerful. It's about what it takes for you to get there, and all the things you overcome.
Yeah. Well, and she also has, it's almost like, that she's blind, but they don't make it her entire personality either. Yeah. And she has the personal development with like the angst between her parents and her at the start, and she eventually you grow and you mature. All these great things. And the last example I'll throw in here is another great example of storytelling is in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, that the animated film that Sony did. One of the characters in there, in this multiverse of different characters who are Spider-Man or whatever, Spider-Gwen, this female character. And I remember someone being like, saying, I don't know, using that as some sort of, oh, I bet you think that's woke too, because she's so much better than the main character Miles Morales. And I was like, no, not at all. She's been established. She's been doing it for years before this guy who's just getting his powers. They didn't make her overpowered to the point where she was better than every single other person. She had weakness, she had character flaws, but she's, she was appropriately skilled for where she was in the universe. Whereas all these other examples are people just like, oh, I pick up something for the first time and I win, and and I'm a boss babe because of it or whatever, and it's stupid. And it makes me, and I thought one more thing that I hate, I promise I'll shut up, but is the other thing is when people talk about things like, oh, so you're saying that, like, we'll use the example of Star Wars. Oh, it's unrealistic that Rey would be better than a Jedi Master. You're worried about realism in a world where there are flying wizards with light sticks. And it's like, when you establish rules of a universe, like, for instance, in the world of Avatar, there are people who can manipulate elements. That's the rule. It's not unlimited. And the best stories They set the rules in a realistic way. They make the world feel alive, and they make it feel so that it's not just arbitrary. They set consistency up. But the most important thing is good stories have characters who feel realistic, because it doesn't matter what the context is. It doesn't matter if you're a race car driver, if you're a pirate, if you're a wizard shooting spells, or if you're just a businessman. The best characters have human attributes and have human growth, regardless of the context around them. And that is oftentimes what feels unrealistic, is when the rules get changed or the personalities aren't well written to adapt to them. Okay, we'll move on to our next post. And I just wanted to shout out my coworker, Liv Finna, who's our Center for Education Director at Washington Policy Center. She's great. She shared an image that reads, "Our public education system is failing and will be the laughingstock of the world if it isn't already another progressive failure." Which, I mean, it is progressive. I wouldn't just say it's Democrat, to be clear, but I would say it has been progressive from the start. But the cringe post comes here in this comment that reads, "The educational system is not failing. The teachers are not failing. Children today are smarter than ever. There are some problems with the families of the year 2022. That is documented by the fact that there are 32,000 homeless school-aged children in Washington state." And I guess my first inclination was just to say two things can be true, right? Like, what do you mean? What do you mean the educational system isn't available? And I would say that children today are smarter than ever, not because of the education system, but because of the tools we've created that allow anyone to be. I mean, think about it this way: children, or many adults, had to struggle to learn how to read back in the day. And when they found someone who could read, and they would, they're working, but they found someone, they would spend hours learning how to read overnight, spending their nights and then waking up in the morning, working all day, finding this person who's willing to teach them, pay them to learn to read as an adult in their 40s. Meanwhile, now we have baby books, right? Like, we just have books that you can go to buy at the store to help your baby learn how to read. And it's like normal, expected that. It's not part of the education system that's done that. It was the printing press. It was the vast wealth that free markets have created so that you have these things available for cheap, so that most families can afford to go out buying baby books or just books in general. I learned vocabulary words that were beyond my, general age because I read Bionicle comics growing up.
Yeah.
Like the access we have to information is not because of our education system.
Yep.
And to say that there are problems with families in 2022 and there are a bunch of homeless kids, yeah, that's tragic and that's terrible. That has nothing to do with the fact that the education system still is failing. It's just such a non sequitur.
I think that, I mean, you have to say something like, they're smarter than ever, but smarter compared to who today? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's exactly the key, because it's like you're saying, we've built up so much knowledge, and it's so easy to assimilate all this across all cultures right now. It's like, yeah, you should be the smartest of your version of all history, because of just all the knowledge that we've got. We know more than we've ever known before, and we have different mediums of teaching. But if you look at, us in comparison to other countries and students and things like that, we're not doing so hot. And then, this is always evidenced by man on the street interviews, where they'll go interview someone in New York or San Francisco. It's like, hey, can you name how many states do we have? And people can never get it right and stuff like that. The other side of it, though, that really gets to me is, it's that this person is right, that there are a lot of problems with families, and that does play into the fact that we don't have as good an education system. But it's like, okay, why are we having troubles with families? Maybe it's because that we've outsourced, and families have been told to outsource the raising and rearing of children to the very public school system that this person says and claims is such a success and is not failing. It's like, by all objective measures, if you're going to compare it, not on a curve, but on actual, like, hey, are we getting smarter compared to other countries? We are failing, and our children are less moral. They're less grounded in truth. They're less prone to actually be able to generate value upon graduation, whether it be from college or from high school. And yes, that it does have come down to the fact that the family unit is systematically being destroyed. And this person just totally neglects, like, they recognize that there's problems with families, but they can't grapple with the fact that it's like, hey, maybe one of the reasons the family system is breaking down is because we've outsourced that to the public school system. We should just do away with it. And I think that, people say, well, who's going to educate the children? It's like, well, we didn't have like federally managed education for a long time in the United States. And in fact, once we actually did federalize it, testing standards have gone down every year since, never really improved. So if we're going to, not saying that correlation always equals causation, but that's pretty strong correlation right there. The second you institute, the Department of Education, the very thing that they're supposed to be improving continues to dip.
Right. And it's like by every objective measure of how you would evaluate a department, it's failing by its own standards, by external standards. And that's you don't even have to be a genius to see that on the local level. So Leave is based in Seattle, so I don't know if this commenter is or not. It's a high likelihood that they're at least based in Washington. But I don't see how you can say the teachers are not failing when in Washington State, the Seattle Public School District has decided, or multiple actually, not even just Seattle. I think maybe Kent. Could be mistaken on that. There's at least one or two other school districts that are going to strike. And it's like we've just had 2 years of either completely shut down or partially hybrid or all remote, sessions for these kids who are, a lot of whom don't have access to internet very reliably. And, by every objective standard that you can measure, students have been absolutely devastated in terms of the math and reading levels that they're at and all these kinds of things. And then the teachers are saying, no, we're going to strike. It's like, no, I think that's a big failing. And then the good, the teachers who I respect overwhelmingly, and I'm pretty sure this is a common sentiment across a lot of teachers, good and bad, are getting burned out and leaving. And then the other teachers are trying to teach your kid how to do a lap dance or dance on a stripper pole. So I don't think you can say the teachers are not failing. When you look at your evidence run, now, are there a lot of teachers who are doing great? Sure, I'm fine. I'm sure there are plenty doing fine. And I'm also sure they're probably on their way out because they're going to get burned by the system pretty quick, as almost every teacher friend I know has, and every teacher that I read who tries to put in effort and they don't get rewarded. And it's like, if you want to say the teachers aren't failing, then you have to acknowledge the education system is the one that's putting good teachers in bad positions. So maybe the teachers aren't failing because they're burning out. It's the education system. But you're denying that either are failing. No, it's the system itself is failing. The teachers are failing in many ways. And the increase in intelligence is completely in spite of that. Yes. And I don't think that children are necessarily even being taught where maybe children are more intelligent in the sense that they have more access to knowledge and they can ingest knowledge at a faster rate because of these advances. But I also think that we are not necessarily any better than we were in an ethical, moral sense, right? Humanity isn't this progressive, always getting better trajectory in terms of ethics. And we tend to look back with chronological snobbery on things like, child sacrifice. And yet we are the biggest purveyors of child sacrifice in history, undoubtedly, because of abortion. So, you can say that your children are smarter than ever. And in a literal sense that can be true. But I also think that if you're looking to the education system to bring up children, which, as I think you correctly illustrated and highlighted, is a bad idea, I think it's lacking in that regard as well. And I think directly linked to the education system are some of these awful ways that we're getting kids taught how to behave, not just what to learn in terms of math and reading. Okay. Our next post reads, Tom Brady had a $1 million PPP loan forgiven. Khloe Kardashian had her $1.25 million loan forgiven. P. Diddy had his $2 million loan forgiven. Reese Witherspoon had her $1 million loan forgiven. Jay-Z and Jared Kushner, both billionaires, had each of their $2 million loans fully forgiven. Numerous members of Congress from both parties had their loans forgiven. I really don't want to hear anyone annoyed about $10,000 in student loan debt being forgiven. Shut up. So the first thing I want to point out is that here's the trickery. Here's the visual trickery, the deceptive thing this post is doing. It's listing out multiple rich individuals with high amount loans being forgiven. Then it says, I don't want you to be annoyed about forgiving $10,000 in student loan debt. Okay, if you actually wanted to be a little bit more one-to-one or honest, you would realize that there are about 43 million students who qualify for student loan debt. And, let's assume that, some of those aren't going to get the full 10,000. Let's be generous and say that half of them are going to get under the full 10,000 or whatever. And so we'll have the amount of what the 10,000 for the 43 million students is. And you recognize, no, you shouldn't be getting mad about $10,000 in student loan debt being forgiven. You have to be mad more at about like $250 billion of student loans being forgiven. Yeah. And that's a little bit more than 2 million listed here. Now, that being said, both suck. And no one, it's like you can't, why does this person think you have to be only mad at one? It's like, no, the PPP loans were also terrible. It was also part of the massive inflation. It was also part of the big corporate bailouts, both for wealthy people, for congressmen, for big corporations. No, these are all terrible. Like, we don't believe in, using the force to extract money from the taxpayer and then give that to people because they're rich. That's stupid. Or because they made a bad decision. These are both terrible things. Why do I have to choose which one to be mad at? Why can't I be mad at both?
I think even if I totally agree with you, and don't like any of the taxation or redistribution of wealth, whether it be to the wealthy or to the not so wealthy. I actually saw an article today that basically said, oh yeah, like this year, Americans will pay more in taxes than they will on food and healthcare combined, which is kind of, I think it was like $16,000 in taxes. And then on food and healthcare, they'll spend about $15,000. So we let no one say that we don't have a taxation problem. Yeah. But even if we grant them that, we say, hey, it's okay for them to take taxes and for them to pay off loans and stuff like that. You still run into the issue that like students signed up, said, give me this money and I will pay it back. Like, as illegitimate as the government and its ability to lend out your money is, they still signed something that said, I will take if you give me this money, I'll pay it back. All these guys that got PPP loans said, hey, I'm going to borrow money, and the only way I'll pay it back if I don't keep my people employed during this time. That was the criteria for these loans to be forgiven, is that and that was the under the auspice of, oh, well, we're going to prop up these businesses and give them money so that they can keep people employed, and we're not going to go into recession because of that stuff. We got to make sure everyone stays afloat. Those people held up their end of the bargain. Or, I mean, they held up their end of the bargain enough that the government was like, oh, yeah, like you kept people employed to our standards. So they did what they said that they were going to do when they signed the paper. I don't like it. I think it is a bailout and a handout to socialism for the wealthy. But regardless, like, even if you grant that premise, they're still in the right because they did what they said they would agree to do. And the students that took out the loans are not doing what they said they're going to do, and they're going to get bailed out in spite of it.
Well, and people might say, well, it's just so much worse system for the PPP loans to be offered to say you can take this money and we'll forgive it if you meet these criteria. That's terrible. And it's like, okay, what message are you sending then when you forgive $10,000 in student loan debt to future students? You're showing them that the exact same deal applies, right? You're telling them, hey, this is a loan, but hold out long enough and we'll forgive it. Wink, wink. And of course, the terrible thing there is that they will, and more people will take out the loans. The prices keep raising, the interest keeps accruing. Maybe some forgiveness happens. Students are still stuck in debt because most of them aren't going to get forgiven, and then the taxpayer's on the hook yet again. So even if you're right that of these things you should be more mad in terms of number of quantity, or at least the way that the structure set up about the first, you have to acknowledge that by forgiving the second, you're turning the second into the first as well. So it's just a different target audience. And you're right. Like the other thing about it too is the PPP loans were offered in a sort of this danged if you do, danged if you don't scenario where the government forced all these businesses closed. And it's like, even if you can operate remotely, you can't affect the world around you, right? It's like, if you can somehow, I don't know, if you're like a one-man shop and you work from home making windows or something like that, and the world around you is shut down. Well, even if you can keep making windows, that doesn't mean that the neighbor who can't go to work has the budget now to be able to buy your windows, right? So even if you did everything and the lockdowns did not affect you personally, the world around you was affected by the government. So again, not a good solution. The PPP loans weren't, but it was also the scenario where the government specifically offered these loans to try to ameliorate the effect the government specifically had. And so you almost have the Ayn Rand situation there, where she took Social Security, even though she was this big anti-government, anarchist and against government programs like that. But she's like, it's my money. Like they took it from me my whole life. Why would I not collect a pittance of it back? And so, there are different philosophical takes here on whether it's ethical to take it and get it forgiven or not. But either way, like you point out, the circumstances as they met their end of the bargain, and then the other thing is the context around them was the government denied them and put them in a situation where they need that. Whereas the government only really offered the student loans. No one was forced to take those, and they didn't have their livelihood endangered by not taking them. All right, we'll move to our next post. This one's a little short one, but I saw it as an ad and I just wanted to die a little bit inside. It is a sponsored post from Pfizer that reads, "Our commitment to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions and aim to achieve the voluntary net zero standard by 2040. And then it has a big image of a chalkboard with "climate change is real" written over and over on it. This one's funny again, not super deep, but I wanted to point it out because even the imagery of writing the "climate change is real" over and over, I mean, it's the specific, it's like the Bart Simpson, the school kid being punished, having to write like, I will not steal things from the teacher, or I will not hit other students, over and over. But the way that this image is, I mean, if you're listening to this, go to cringepost.com and look at this, or watch our YouTube video, because man, the image is just so striking of like indoctrination. It just looks like they're like, we are going to tell you what to think. Look at the wall. The writing's on the wall over and over. Climate change is real. Climate change is real. And of course, this is coming from Pfizer. Why do I care what Pfizer thinks about climate change? It's just another example of a big corporation not being just this, altruistic, we're just going to do help people out with the vaccines. It's all part of this oligopoly of thinking of how they want to control the population and get them into the right mind think.
This reminds me of the meme, the howdy kids. I'm just like you. You going skating, like it's like they're Pfizer. It's like, what business do you have being in this? And then 2, why are you paying to let me know that you're doing this? It's so cringy, and like it just shows you what side they fall on with everything. It should make you very skeptical of all the climate change stuff. If a very trusted source like Pfizer is willing to pay to let you know what they think of it. This made me think of the little sponsored plaque up there. Made me think of the fact that Pfizer and pharmaceutical companies compose 70% of advertising dollars for TV networks. Like they're by far in a way the largest amount of spenders on those ad networks. And so then you start to realize like, oh shoot, like all these CNN and news places, like they're tied, directly or indirectly, very much so, to whether Pfizer succeeds or not, and other pharmaceutical companies. And so it's just really weird to me. The left used to be really against big pharma, rightfully so. And then suddenly, because the right people said one thing and the wrong people said another, suddenly, it's oh, we like them. Like, oh, I'm getting Pfizer tattooed on my arm, and Pfizer's like leaning into it. They're like, okay, like the next big cult thing is this climate change deal. Like, let's make a whiteboard, kind of like what's that gal in Harry Potter that has the pink.
I will not tell lies.
Yeah.
Dolores Umbridge.
Yes, Dolores Umbridge. Dolores Umbridge makes Harry Potter right over Harry Potter right over and over. I will not tell lies. It just reminds me of that. It's just so creepy and weird.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I don't know. This doesn't help a lot to, pacify the people who I think have rightly said that the next lockdown scenario will be over climate change. The next global
emergency. Did you see the flatten the curve thing that the European Union president said?
No.
Dude, so they're talking about the blackouts, rolling blackouts in the EU, and like, hey, we might need to enforce these to flatten the peak energy demand curve.
Stop.
I'm not joking, man. I'll send it to you after this. But yeah, she was up there. She's from France, I think, and she was talking about, or Belgium, I think is what it is. And we need to flatten the curve, the peak energy demand curve. It's like, wow, like, you realize that worked really well last time, and so you're using the same words again.
They are just laughing at us. They're saying, how much can we get away with? And these people will still bow the knee or bend the knee.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay. This post comes from Reddit. It's a comment on an article from, I believe, the Washington Post, something like that. I don't know. They all kind of blend together. This one was, I think, an opinion piece that was talking about John Roberts joining the whining chorus Supreme Court justices. So this article snippet reads, appearing at a legal conference Friday, Roberts declared, you don't want the you don't want the political branches telling you what the law is, and you don't want public opinion to be the guide of what the appropriate decision is. He continued, yes, all of our opinions are open to criticism. In fact, our members do a great job of criticizing some opinions from time to time. But simply because people disagree with an opinion is not basis for criticizing the legitimacy of the court. And then we'll talk about this. And then there's a comment that is making an Office reference here that reads, I declare legitimacy. Seems like that's how the justices thinks this works. Nothing they say will reverse the last 6 months or however long it's been now. And of course, this comment's referring to the decisions that have been made, and how that makes them illegitimate or whatever. And it's an accidentally based comment because, yeah, I declare legitimacy. That's kind of how the government works. That's kind of how everyone who is in power is in power. Do you realize that you appeal to this piece of paper that says, I declare legitimacy? That's what the Constitution says. That's it. And these people, ironically, they're criticizing. Let me see, how does this work? They're criticizing John Roberts, who's criticizing people who criticize the court because they don't like the decisions. And so this person's saying, wow, John Roberts is silly for criticizing that because he's not legitimate. But the only reason that this person is criticizing John Roberts for saying that is because John Roberts is part of a decision-making things that this person doesn't like. So it's all a matter of whether or not you like the decisions and you like the opinions. It's just a big flip-flop, people don't like the opinion. John Roberts doesn't like that the people don't like the opinions. This person doesn't like that John Roberts doesn't like that person has the opinion, and that person doesn't like the opinion of that. It's so stupid, and this person literally is so close to being right. But just the problem is the people whose opinions they do agree with, like the Democratic majorities in the House and Senate and the presidency, well, they like their opinion, so they're legitimate.
Yeah, people will talk about how it's like, well, it's our government elected officials. They're elected by the public for the public, by the people for the people. That's like, okay, but like, don't you realize that there's like 74 million people that didn't vote for the current guy in office, and they still have to live under his rule and tyranny and whoever he appoints to whatever court? You and I are kind of a fan of like some of the decisions the justices have handed down, specifically like the knocking down Biden's 100-person vaccine mandate. But I just wish that mechanism wasn't there in the first place, because the very mechanism that allows the judges to smack that mandate down is also the mechanism that gave Biden the ability to, declare it via executive order and grant that power to OSHA, to mandate work safety or whatever, instead of just letting businesses decide what is safe for them or what is not safe for them. The only true like legitimacy that you'll ever have is one that you grant to someone, right? And that's what people try to mean. And that's why it's like you were talking about, like, well, if it's a decision I like, then it's legitimate. It's like, you're right, it's legitimate to you, and it's not legitimate to someone else. The only difference is in the system we have right now, this government system, is that you can impose your will, which is illegitimate, upon someone else. Like, you don't have a legitimate claim to forcing someone else to take 30% of their income, or forcing another person to get a shot, or forcing another person to, not chop down a tree on their property that they own and paid money for. That's illegitimate of you. And so, like you're saying, this person is so close, because it's like they're realizing that, like, oh, like, these people are making decisions for me that I don't like, and I didn't vote for them to be in there in the first place. I didn't vote for the person that put them in there to be there in the first place. Like, that seems illegitimate to me. And he's right, or she's right, whoever this is. Like, they are totally right that it is illegitimate. Now apply that, to the other person that thinks that about you, and suddenly we'll start getting somewhere. Everyone will just start actually living in a liberty-minded way.
Somehow, I think that if this person were to be asked if they support, like what Ron DeSantis is doing for the Floridians there, they would probably throw a fit. And it's like, I don't know, a majority of people there declared him legitimate. So I think you have to go along with it. But of course, these people are never consistent about that kind of thing. So they're going to,
or Donbass with the Russians. The majority of folks in the Donbass region in Ukraine voted to rejoin Russia. And apparently that wasn't good enough. We had to send in the Nazis in the Azov battalion to stir up trouble and keep them with us. So these people to believe in democracy and all these things when it suits them. They they perfectly love the Supreme Court decision that upheld Obamacare, the constitutionality of Obamacare. But it's like, Obamacare basically mandates that doctors can be slaves, at the end of the day, when all the way comes down to it. Like, that's illegitimate of you to do that. We don't believe in slavery or anything like that. But these people love that. And so, like you're saying, there's no principle undergirding this. It's just whatever I like is legitimate, whatever I don't like is illegitimate. And I will use everything in my power, including the government gun, to force you to conform.
So the question I would ask this person is, first I would say, what would make the Supreme Court legitimate to you? Because they're not going to admit it's just doing decisions that they like. They'd probably say either permitting decisions by majority vote or themselves being majority voted in. Okay. And at which point I would probably ask them, where does the body voting get their legitimacy? Because if it's just any group voting on anything, shoot, I'll get 9 of my friends and we'll all vote that you owe me 10% of your future earnings for the rest of your life. And hey, I mean, that's 9-1, And if you're going to grab 10 more of your friends, well, I'll grab 10 more of mine. Where do we draw these artificial lines? What makes, and then I'm just going to say, oh, no, your people, they're not legitimate. They don't have authority. My people are legitimate. The act of legitimacy is just completely insane until you understand it goes down to voluntary agreements between individuals, right? That's the only way that legitimacy can be enacted in a real way, is when both people recognize something. Otherwise, it's just threat of force, which is another use of either extortion or slavery or both.
Yep.
Okay, and for our last cringe of the episode, we've got Ben Shapiro, the 5 lessons America learned from 9/11, then forgot. I'm sure all 5 of them are marvelous, but we're focusing on one here. And this one reads, the second lesson Shapiro identified is that real or perceived weakness, whether economic, military, or ideological, invites aggression. Quote, if you read the manifesto of Osama bin Laden after 9/11, it was all about how the United States was basically a paper tiger, had made a bunch of promises, had not fulfilled those promises, the United States had run from conflict, Shapiro noted, citing the United States' disastrous withdrawal from Somalia, its inaction in the face of al-Qaeda bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and the USS Cole, all in the years immediately preceding 9/11. Listen, Ben, you're good on so much, and then you just bust her out when it comes to foreign policy. I don't think that the second, the identifying perceived weakness, I don't think that that's quite as effective of a draw as it is, making them making yourself being perceived as an enemy to begin with, right? There are plenty of weak countries out there. Like, I mean, shoot, why didn't Al-Qaeda just attack Albania? I mean, their defenses were minimal, right? You could have crashed a plane into like Tirana and killed a bunch more people than you did in the Twin Towers. What? That's so weird. That's so weird that there's all these weak countries in the world, but for some reason they attacked America, who actually has a lot of resources to fight back and bomb, which of course we hadn't done at all leading up to this, right? It was, we didn't do anything to provoke them. That would be crazy. They just chose us out of the I guess they hated our freedoms. That's probably why.
Yes. Yeah. That's so this, I saw this, I was trying to find like an actual text article so we could show it, but I heard this on his podcast today, and it's, he was talking through this, and I was like, okay, well, he's talking about, bin Laden's manifesto, and there's a lot of different reasons bin Laden chose to do what he did. Many of them very self-interested reasons, but you can't ignore the fact that he got people to hop on planes and drive them into buildings and crash them and kill themselves essentially for his cause. And so he cites within his, whether or not he believed in his Kool-Aid or whatever, he had Kool-Aid that appealed to people that were going to hop on these planes and do this thing. And so he in specifically his manifesto, I thought Ben would get to it. And it surprised me that he didn't, because I was like, how is he going to deal with bin Laden talking about the massacre at Qana? Which is like a huge driving force for a lot of these people that actually hopped on the planes. Essentially the United States killed a bunch of women and children, which is called the massacre of Qana, and launched a bunch of missiles onto different hospitals and schools and tons of evil, really, really bad things, and as well as arming various entities around the world to do this. Furthermore, we established a bunch of bases all over there in the Middle East. We forced them to sell their oil at certain prices or forced them to restrict their production, basically crippling their economies and making it really hard for anyone that was not, part of the Saudi royalty or any of those things to actually rise out of poverty. And so bin Laden used all of these different talking points and facts. It's a fact we were bloodthirsty murderers over there killing people for oil and for other reasons. He used these facts to get people inspired enough to believe in it enough for them to hop on a plane and drive it into a building and kill themselves and other people. And so, people will be like, well, I just don't understand that. And it's like, no, you do understand it, because they did a fraction of what we did to them. We starved 500,000 of their children in the 80s and 90s to death. And we went over there and bombed the crap out of them. And then they flew some planes in retaliation, killed about 3,000 other people. God rest in peace to all those folks. But we went over there and started another war and killed millions of people. So we do understand it. We would do exactly, and we do exactly what they do when they're aggressed upon. So it's just, this is such to me, it seems like it's such an obvious blind spot. For Ben Shapiro, who I respect, in the Daily Wire, they have a really good cultural pulse. The documentary "What Is a Woman" is a fantastic documentary. And he's really, really good on a lot of things and very logical on a lot of things. And so it's really bizarre to me that someone that's like that just can't connect that, like, hey, you go murder people. It's quite the opposite of what he's saying. Like, we went over there, showed a lot of strength, showed a lot of aggression. And oh no, why are they retaliating against us? If, like you're saying, if they were all about like whatever country is weak and like propagating Western values or whatever, like there are dozens of countries closer, way weaker, that took way less preparation, that they could have gone and destroyed. Why did they choose America? And maybe Ben hasn't actually read the manifesto. Maybe he's just quoting it because he thinks it supports it. It's like, you should read the whole thing, man.
I think that he's doing something very specific there, where he cites, and I think that the deceptive thing that when you read this, is you look at all these examples that are cited about the US being weak and not following through with things. But once you realize that that's only, that's not the why they attacked. That's the why they attacked now, right? Recognize that this is something that hasn't happened. It's not like they woke up one day and decided, hey, we should attack someone today. Who look around, oh, look, the US hasn't fulfilled a lot of their obligations across the seas. Let's attack them. It's like, we've done all these aggressive things that have destroyed their lands, that have murdered their people, that have starved their children. And now they're waiting for a time to strike. So they can list we're attacking now because you're not following through, like withdrawing from these places or running away from conflict. But that's no more say why you're, that's more of the reason why you're attacking to begin with, than it is like for me to say, oh, well, we're shooting the Death Star in the exhaust port because that's a weak spot and we'll blow up the whole thing in one torpedo. I'm not blowing up the Death Star because it has a weak point. I'm blowing up the Death Star because it blew up Alderaan. Like he's conflating the why we attack now with the why we attack. And so him leaving out the part where the US aggressed in all these ways shows that he's trying to hide that from people and try to get them on board with that. No. They attacked us because we showed weakness, which of course makes very little sense. The only scenario where that kind of makes sense is sometimes there are schoolyard bullies who pick on kids who are weak just because. Now, is this a possibility? It is a possibility, but like you said, he had to convince other people to get on board of a cause that made them commit suicide, right? And that's not something that, most of the time bullies don't just like take people down at their own expense. They push other people down to prop themselves up. So even if Osama bin Laden is just a bully, like you said, he had to have something that was convincing enough to enough people that they were willing to sacrifice their lives ideologically to get behind it. That gets them no higher reward. It only would serve Osama bin Laden if he was just a pure bully. More likely, there's this ideological bent, at least for the people committing it. What's really frustrating is a lot of Christians follow this line of logic and believe this kind of thing, when they also would use the defense that, and I think rightly so, about the disciples, as part of that, apologetic for Jesus, right? Is like, well, why would 12 and more people go through torture, go through these agonizing deaths, proclaiming the truth of something they knew to be false. They didn't, because they saw Jesus rise from the dead. They spoke with him after the fact. They knew his gospel to be true, and they were willing to die for it because they believed it. You don't become a martyr for something you don't believe wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
And so these people crashing planes, regardless of if that's the right course of action, spoiler alert, it's not. They had a cause they believed in because the U.S. had put itself in a position where they were motivated. It wasn't like oh man, we hate their freedoms, or like, man, their values are so bad. If I just kill myself here, this will stop it. They were motivated by a righteous fury from the attacks that we had done on them.
It reminds me of this is a few years ago now, but I can't remember if it was this guy or Matt Walsh, but they were commenting on like a new season of Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan. And I remember watching, because my dad's a huge fan of Tom Clancy and Jack Ryan and all this stuff. And this is the series with John Krasinski. And the first season, did you see it?
I haven't seen it, no.
Okay. I don't think you'll care. It's not one that you would necessarily like.
Go for
it. But basically the villain in it it's set in the Middle East, and the villain in the season opens with him and his little brother, like their kids, and there's an airstrike, and his little brother gets killed and his family gets killed, and he's like orphaned, and he becomes like this terrorist warlord kind of guy, with like, I want to blow up a nuke, in the United States because of this whole thing. And it's like, okay, that's like a really straightforward, clear motivation. That story has been told thousands of times in other stories. Like the normal kid experiences some sort of trauma and becomes evil, and doesn't internalize it very well and becomes evil. And I remember Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro were talking. One of the guys, they were talking like, oh, like, I really like it. It espouses good old-fashioned American values. I just don't like the it wasn't anti-war, like anti-patriotic statement, that these terrorists like have a good reason or whatever. Like they really humanize them in this way. I was like, dude, that's exactly what happened though. Like we blew up their mothers, daughters, fathers, sons. Like we blew up all those guys over there mercilessly, and we starved them to death. Like you recognize this in Star Wars, like how good intentions, facing tragedy or trauma can become evil. Like you see it in all these stories, and you love it in those stories because it's like it's good versus evil. That's how evil is created, within humans in a lot of ways. Is one evil begets another evil, and it's like it's crazy that they just couldn't see it, within that. It's very much like the people like made fun of Ron Paul when he was calling Rudy Giuliani on this stuff in the debates, and basically, hey, I believe in blowback, and I think if we're over there doing this stuff, eventually they're going to come back over here. And Giuliani just leans on I was the mayor or governor or whatever it was of New York, and at the time, and how dare you say those types of things? It's like just in the plea, it's blind appeal to emotion to rile people up to take action that limits freedoms, kills human life, and creates destruction. And Ben and Matt Walsh are really good at seeing that when it comes to the COVID stuff, but they can't see it when it comes to the military industrial complex. Like it's like this is just blind appeal to emotion to get us to go bomb other people and fund our weapons companies. It's really bizarre to me. It's one of the reasons like I'm not fully all in on the Daily Wire. It's like I wish they could get really good on that side of it. And there's a few of them that are okay, but for the most part, not very good.
It's just all you have to ask them is if, just in a pure hypothetical, if the US hijacked some planes and crashed it into like Saudi Arabia, would you, well, maybe that's a bad example there. We're kind of in with them deep, I guess. But, you crash it into, Iraq. And would you expect them to have a similar response the US did when the hijackers took our planes? Would you expect them to want to mobilize and retaliate in some way, shape, or form? Because if the answer is yes, well, guess what? The hijackers
did that. We just did it with missiles.
Exactly. So all you have to do is sort of if you think our response was justified in any way, shape, or form, then you understand that they are going to do something similar, and that's what this was. Again, it doesn't make it justifiable. It doesn't make it good. But if you recognize the reality of that's the natural response to things, because it's just so absurd to say that's what we did. We were attacked and we retaliated. And they didn't we just have to get them past the point of recognizing 9/11 wasn't the start of history, and the attacks were not initiated by them. That 9/11 was a retaliation. And I think once you understand that, and it goes further back, and there's a long history surrounding these things that create incentives and create motives, then you understand it's not a simple matter of they just smashed our window and now we're going to go beat them up for it. It's like we smashed their window first and they're trying to throw back so that, we don't hit them as hard. So
eventually
anyway.
someone has to not retaliate. Like that's just the fact of it. I mean, we could probably do a whole episode on everything, but it's like we went into Afghanistan with the goal of getting bin Laden, and then at Tora Bora we let him go. I mean, it's just like even if you take their pretense of like, oh, we went there to go get him and that's it, and it expands like, well, you let him go because you want to go into all these different places. So it's just all unfortunate levels of unfortunate.
Exactly right. Well, we've got that full episode for you there, folks. Thanks for sticking around, and we will see you on the next one. Thanks so much.